Hello and welcome to the fifth in a series of 6 presentations in the State Historic Preservation Office's Shut the Door! Barns in Oklahoma series, featuring Dr. Brad Bays, professor in the Oklahoma State University Geography Department. My name is Shay Otley, and I will be one of your moderators this evening. This presentation will be recorded and posted later for viewing. From 2009 to 2014, through a contract with the Oklahoma State Historic Preservation Office, Dr. Bays traveled the state of Oklahoma, visiting every county, looking at historic barns. Tonight, Dr. Bays will discuss Oklahoma's special purpose barns and farm structures. If you have questions, please post them to the Q&A feature of the application, and Linda Ozan will share those with Dr. Bays at the end of his presentation. Please note that the public will not see the questions until it's published by the moderator. If we do not get to your question by the end of the evening, we will provide the questions to Dr. Bays and we'll get back to you with an answer. Thank you for attending and enjoy the presentation.
All right. Thanks a lot, Shay. Tonight we're going to cover something that I find really interesting, and that is the things that are out there that represent the past agricultural systems in Oklahoma, but that are not necessarily barns. Some of them are, but anyway, I call this the special purpose barns and structures. So let's get started here. I've got a lot of things to cover, and I'm going to go kind of fast, but you're happy to, or please feel free to ask questions after the presentation. I thought I'd start, and this is also in alphabetical order. I could have arranged it, by theme or something like that. All right, so down in Old Greer County, and this is a map that shows Old Greer County before it was divided up into the other three counties, new three counties. And that zone in orange over here is just an area where apparently there was a sale of boxcars when that line folded, and people use these boxcars for hay storage. I just had a few pictures, but you see red boxcars, older boxcars around the landscape, a lot of them being used for hay storage. Okay, so that's kind of a dumb one. All right, broiler houses are what we find in northwest Arkansas and a few other areas of the United States where we have large-scale poultry production. And this is I have some photos from the Oklahoma Historical Society's research gateway, and so I encourage anybody to use that. And so this is a photo from the 1950s in Adair County of the inside of a broiler house. Broiler houses are probably familiar. You're probably familiar with these. They are in the news perhaps a little bit now because of their sort of environmental impact of large-scale poultry production. But they have been around for a long time. They just haven't been on the scale that we have today. But this is what the inside of a broiler house looked like. And I don't think this is the exact boiler house, although it's in Adair County near Stillwell. But this is another example of an older broiler house, the old style. Now the new ones, of course, are larger. This one happens to be 300 feet long, so it's like a football field long. I think 50 feet wide. So they normally raised one crop or two crops a year in the old days. 48,000 chicks at a time were raised in this thing, and they usually got like 96,000 in a year. So that's the old way of doing it. Now the new ones, and this is also from Adair County. This is a newer chicken operation, or broiler operation, and of course now it's a lot more high tech, and at least in the production side of it. And you can see these long broiler houses with, I don't know if you can see it that well, but you can see the fans on one side, and you can see the grain bins and the feed bins on the other. These are like Fort Knox, actually, because they are so security conscious Nobody is allowed in and out without permission, and usually you have to, like hog barns, you have to scrub down if you do go in, and scrub when you come out. All right, one of the more fascinating sides of the weird types of structures out there are broom corn sheds. I'd heard broom corn before. I knew that Lindsay is the broom corn capital of the world. At least it used to be. And so I was intrigued by, what's broom corn country look like? So down in Garvin County, Garvin, Grady, and McLean County primarily, was an area known for broom corn production. Now, broom corn in the early days of the territory was a crop that was grown pretty widely. In fact, the Panhandle counties, there were about a dozen counties, including the Panhandle County, in like Ellis County, Harper County, Woods County, Alfalfa County. Those counties in the northern western part of the state were pretty big broom corn producing areas. That lasted until about 1914, when the price of wheat went up, and a lot of the broom corn area in the Panhandle got plowed under for wheat production. A lot of us think of the great plow up of the 19 teens being open, basically untilled land, but not necessarily. This is a photo of the other district. So we had two districts that were broom corn specialty zones in the state, the Lindsay district and the Northwest district. Lindsay really never produced more than the Panhandle, but it produced very high quality broom corn. Now, what is broom corn? Broom corn is the raw material of a corn broom. And now it's kind of strange, but brooms were like some of the other consumer goods that you find produced in small towns, what we call in geography, we call low order places on the central place system, right? So the lower order activities, including things like manufacturing of mattresses, manufacturing of ice cream, that always took place locally until about World War II. And brooms were like that also. So there were broom factories in every larger town in the state. Oklahoma City had a dozen of them. So the broom making business, kind of bizarre. So anyway, the broom corn commodity, or the commodity is referred to as brush, broom corn brush, and that's what the production was like. So here you're seeing the post harvest and post drying of broom corn brush, and what they're doing here is actually shaking seeds out of the heads of the dried broom corn for next year's crop. And the thing that you see in the back is what we're going to find, the broom corn shed. And it's nothing to write home about. It's just a pole barn with a bunch of slats in it, but it's pretty distinctive. And it's surprising that, there are still some around. Now, the broom corn business in Lindsay lasted from 1906, when the first crop was put in, until, according to the International Broom Corn Museum, I think that's what it's called, lasted until 1982. But actually, the broom corn business in the United States for handmade corn brooms really began to decline in the 1960s, as after the United States allowed the importation of corn brooms directly from Mexico without placing a duty on them. So essentially what happened is this business went south of the border, and that's probably appropriate. Much of the labor in the early broom corn harvesting was from Mexico, and it was not an easy task. These people were these migrant workers, itinerant farm laborers, would come up in the summer spend about 3 weeks around Lindsay. At night they would basically sleep on the Washita River, on the bank of the Washita River, and in the daytime they would go out to the fields and cut broom corn. They actually had names for it. The term was the broom corn Johnnies. Here they are cutting broom corn in 1967. One of the sort of the last rounds of the broom corn business. Now, broom corn looks a lot like corn. It's taller, but it has the characteristics of Johnson grass. And if you've ever picked Johnson grass with bare hands, you know not to ever try to pick Johnson grass with your bare hands. So this is a hard labor stuff that was grueling work because it had to be done in the heat of the summer, and it had to be done within about 2 or 3 weeks. So imported, basically itinerant labor got paid one time after the harvest, and that was in cash. That cash payment then was given by the landowner or the farmer. The farmer had to come up with the cash. So to do that, he generally sold his crop ahead of the harvest to a broom corn dealer who was basically a wholesaler, middleman. The wholesaler had already had orders from the broom corn factory, so essentially he was just filling orders. And if the harvest was really good, that meant that the price dropped out. The price of the finished broom corn dropped once all those dealers had met all of their orders. So this was an incredibly volatile. The price of broom corn was incredibly volatile compared to other agricultural commodities like wheat or cotton. So this was the agriculture. The price volatility was pretty much the reason why a lot of farmers never took it any farther. This type of this crop never mechanized. It never mechanized because of the volume. The market was so limited, and there was never enough volume to justify designing harvesters that were, like a combine or something. It couldn't be done very easily. It had to be cut by hand, and then it had to from there you had to process it by hand. So there are lots of photos at the Historical Society showing this kind of thing. So here's some more. This is a really old photo from out in Gage, Ellis County up in the Northwest, back in 1904. And you can see these fellows they've baled the broom corn and they're waiting probably for a wholesaler to give them a price. All right, so this is what the broom corn shed looks like today. Again, the business was died away in the 70s. So these are, probably 50 years old. There is some, of course, utilization in some cases. They make pretty good hay barns, but nothing really that's, incredibly interesting about them other than they are part of that landscape and they're part of that heritage associated with the Washita River bottomlands around Lindsay. So I'll show you a few more of these. Notice also that in this slide, you got wheat production, which is kind of interesting because the wheat production kind of ended broom corn in a lot of places. So anyway, it's no longer broom corn country. It's generally wheat country and cow-calf operations, which is another theme of tonight's talk. The change in agricultural systems. We had a lot greater variety of agriculture in the early days, and these systems adjusted so that today we have generally what people refer to as ranching or cow-calf operations is probably a better way to look at it. So I'll get into that in a little bit. I had just a few other things, items like you find around general farm or general farming farms. That is more or less subsistence, semi-subsistence types of farms. Chicken houses are one thing that you run into a lot. Chicken houses typically have this sort of semi-monitor roof, which is a way to keep your hens warm. There are also buildings that were basically larger scale than this that were hog barns, but I decided not to include those. But some of the chicken houses were kind of neat. This was over in Blaine County in the Gypsum Hills area, and this is one of those barns where, or one of those buildings where the original builder had used gypsum and sandstone with a lot of gypsum in it, so kind of different. And another interesting material, we've seen this before if you've been following all of these presentations. This is down in the Wichita Mountains, and this is a chicken house. The owner told me it's a chicken house, and it's the best built, most permanent chicken house I've ever seen. So anyway, that's just, kind of a neat one. Corn cribs, another facet of the agricultural landscape throughout the United States, or at least the eastern 2/3 of the United States. This particular corn crib, this photo is from the Historical Society. This was actually Will Rogers' boyhood home corn crib, and you can see that we won't talk about log notching yet or anymore, but I wanted to point out the notches on this. This is a great example of a V notch, and V notches were pretty much the best type that you'll see in Oklahoma, although the half dovetail notch is seen rarely. But this was a pretty common sort of notch. Notice also that the foundation of this corn crib is built on rocks, built on stacked rocks. Sometimes you'll see some things different than stones. This is a corn crib, log corn crib from Adair County. Actually, this is Cherokee County, I think. And the notching systems that are used in these corn cribs, this particular corn crib, I would guess, is probably from the middle 20th century. The reason I say that is because the construction is so flimsy and not very well done. It may have served its purpose, but it's just a corn crib. Other log corn cribs using saddle notches. This is a picture of different views of a double crib log barn. A double crib means that it has two of these square units, square walled units that we call cribs, which is confusing to young people who think a crib is a room, a bedroom or something. And then we confuse them more when we talk about log houses, because those are called pens, log pens, not log cribs. Anyway, you don't sleep in the barn. And this is an example of a frame corn crib, resembles the log corn crib. And you'll also notice that the foundation here is made out of stumps. Different types of trees can be used. Bodark is one, Osage orange. Another type that was used frequently were, I can't think of it right off the bat. But anyway, different types of weathery or bug resistant stumps were used. More corn cribs. All right. These are mostly down in the southern part of the state, where a corn crib was often all you really needed for sheltering your livestock. There really wasn't much shelter at all, maybe a horse stall in a small barn like this. Okay, country elevators. Country elevators, what are those? Elevators in the country. No, they're grain elevators. They're small scale grain elevators. And you're probably familiar with the big concrete silo tower grain elevators along the railroad tracks in most railroad towns in the plains. Those large concrete elevators were generally built in the 20s, and they're historical in themselves. They've been surveyed by Dr. David Baird back in the 1980s and 90s for the Historic Preservation Office. But this map shows a black dot at the location of Enid in this 1926 map of agricultural regions in Oklahoma. And you'll notice that the winter wheat region at this time was ended before it reached Texas, which is kind of interesting. But the cotton belt and the wheat belt merged somewhere in southwest Oklahoma at this time. Well, wheat production was concentrated in higher. It was more productive in the eastern part right here, and Enid was unique in that it was also a railroad hub. So here's the production according to the United States Department of Agriculture in 1925. Had a lot of land devoted to wheat production, and this was fairly new. Most of Oklahoma's wheat ground was a post World War I phenomenon. After World War I began, price of wheat took off, and between 1913 and 1919, the end of World War I, the amount of land in winter wheat production in Oklahoma had tripled, and that's just the land. So it tripled over that small number of years, and some farmers did very well. By the 1920s, of course, farm commodity prices began to go into decline, and there was essentially what we have as a sort of long-term farm depression in the 20s, and then the Great Depression hits in the 30s. So around Enid, at this in the 19 teens and 20s, developed a very strong rail hub, and so Enid naturally became a large area for storing wheat and for marketing wheat. It became one of the most important wheat hubs in the region. Now, you know about the huge grain elevators in Enid, which were built in the 20s and the 30s, or began being built in the 20s and 30s. Before that, in the teens, when wheat production was going strong, a lot of farmers had no way to really get their crop to Enid. So what initiated was farmers would have their own granaries, which we're going to look at, and once they harvested their crop, they would transport their crop from the granaries to what they called the country elevators. And the country elevators were sometimes subsidiary to the large line elevators, the large ones that marketed the grain at the railroad. And sometimes they were independent cooperatives. For example, there was an organization called the Oklahoma Wheat Growers Association that developed in the early part of the century. And the Oklahoma Wheat Growers Association in 1927 opened up or began a sort of a cooperative that eventually included around 52 different local country elevators. And so this provided an alternative for marketing grain rather than being completely dependent on the railroad line elevators. So this was part of the sort of the populist movement in the state for farmers to try to get better prices, Wizard of Oz and all that. Here's an example of a country elevator, and I got a grand tour of this one by the owner who's in the photo here. It's a pretty unique operation. You'll generally see a tower on the country elevators that which allows the conveyor cup, the cup conveyor, to be turned around and drop grain into various grain bins. This is one that's not far outside of Enid, and it's a sort of a drive-through. You pull your wagon through that central area, drop the grain through a hole in the floor, and then it's picked up and distributed. Here's another example from that same area. And out in the Panhandle, this is one in This is near Balco in Beaver County, maybe Texas County. Yeah, Texas County. And this is probably one of my favorites. This is out in Cimarron County. So this is ground zero of the Dust Bowl and a relic from the wheat production that preceded, preceded the Dust Bowl during the 19 teens and 20s. Okay, dairy barns. We have a couple of types of dairy barns, or at least the barn scholars, the people who study barns, they like to break things up sometimes. Others don't necessarily do this, but there is a group of people who refer to a certain type of dairy barn as a raised dairy barn, which they just call they explain was a type of barn that was converted to dairy use by creating a poured concrete foundation, basically taking a barn and putting it on top of a concrete foundation, therefore raising it up a little bit. And this is just an example from out in Mayes County. I'm impressed by these because of just the sheer amount of concrete that's involved in it. Another view of this. I got to wrestle a yearling Angus calf getting photos for this barn, so I do remember it pretty well. Anyway, the barn is not used for dairy purposes anymore, like just about every dairy barn we'll see, maybe a few in the Amish country. The dairy industry has consolidated, of course. Now we have just a few big, massive dairies serving, getting fresh milk to people. And in the past, it wasn't like that. Dairy production was regulated by the state, which meant in Oklahoma it really wasn't regulated that much. And only until really World War II and some outbreaks of milk-borne diseases do we have really strong federal regulations, which I'll get to in a minute. But what I'm trying to get at is the dairies that existed around the state, let's say in 1925, probably when this barn was built, were ubiquitous. You had dairy farms all over the place. And each one of those dairy farms contributed milk and cream to a local creamery. And that's where your milk was pasteurized and bottled, and ice cream was produced. So those were all localized until we had highways and truck transport after World War II, especially in the 50s and 60s. So dairy barns and local dairies died out over a period of 30, 40 years. But they left artifacts on the landscape. And these barns were converted after the dairies folded, were converted into other uses, primarily that standard use of the land in most of Oklahoma that used to be agricultural, which is the cow-calf operation. So dairy barns wound up changing over into beef cattle, use for beef cattle. Now, beef cattle, at least in Oklahoma, don't need shelter. They're not sheltered in a barn. Dairy cattle have to be sheltered in the wintertime, and they're little, they're sensitive, and their production rate is affected by their stress level. So that's why we have dairy barns for both caring for cattle in bad weather and early on milk them. All right, so some more raised dairy barns around. This was actually around Noble County, and I'm just I'm impressed by the amount of poured concrete that these things required. They double as bomb shelters. All right, now the thing that you see on this raised dairy barn is a part of the regulations. It follows the regulations that the federal government put out in the 1940s, around 47, I believe, and that is something called the milk house, which we will get to later. So here's another huge abandoned barn, not even used. The area is not even used for grazing beef cattle anymore. But it's just a gargantuan structure that most people probably never notice. This is one from up in northeast Oklahoma. And now we'll look at something called the dairy barn, or what the barn aficionados refer to as the Wisconsin dairy barn, which translates to a really, really big dairy barn. Okay. So I've got just some historical examples of dairy barns. I've recorded the old dairy barn at OSU. I'm not going to give it any credit, but I found this one of the Langston University dairy barn, which is also within our system. So give them a little feature here. This is just some other dairy barns around the state. Notice that the silos are always next to the dairy barns. I'll flip back here. So silos and dairy barns always go together. Sometimes the silos aren't visible, but you have what are called grain bins. And this is a Wisconsin-sized dairy barn down in the southwestern part of the state and around the town of Thomas, I believe. This is in the Amish country, and this is actually this barn is on an old order Amish farm. The owners of the landowners speak with a distinct German accent even today. Another Amish barn. These are still functioning too, and that's why you'll see some of the updated things on these Amish barns. This one is definitely what we would call a Wisconsin-sized dairy barn. It is located near Crescent, somewhere between Crescent and Dover, just west of central Oklahoma. And this is probably bigger. It's as big or bigger than the big Noble County stone hay barn. This is the inside of it. It's got steel superstructure and laminated trusses that form a round roof, it's pretty impressive. And anyway, the ground level is where basically cattle would shelter. They wouldn't be milked in this barn. And this barn really isn't that old. I'm curious as to who owned it. I suppose it was probably a commercial dairy, not an individual farmer. Out in western Oklahoma, early on in the survey, in southwest Oklahoma, I ran across the remains of another gargantuan dairy barn. We know it's a dairy barn because it's huge, and it had a silo, or at least the remains of a silo there. And I chose this photo because, again, this is the dairy landscape that has become the cow-calf operation, which integrates the raising of calves until they're about what they're referred to as yearlings, and they're sold, and the production of replacement cows. So this is the system that is pretty much ubiquitous throughout at least the western half of Oklahoma now. Beef cattle production utilizing winter wheat during the period that winter wheat is just emerging between about November and before it reaches maturity sometime in March. And that allows the fall calving season and the spring calving season to occur on that good winter wheat. It's a great system, and it's the type of system that apparently has adjusted to the economy and the environment of the state. Dairy barns are outmoded, and they're just remnants on the landscape. So here you see some beef calves. Another example of a dairy barn, I've probably shown you this before when we've looked at different materials. This is up in Delaware County in the Chert region. Another example of a dairy barn becoming a beef operation, or at least associated with a beef operation. This is up in Balco, in the Panhandle. And this is the Zinc Ranch barn over by Sand Springs, just north of the highway there, and certainly a big investment in stone. Another one, you've probably seen this before in Muskogee, raised dairy barn, or Wisconsin dairy barn. I wasn't able to get access to this place, so I took a shot of it from the road with my zoom lens. It's not the greatest photo, but this is a huge barn right outside of Bristow in Creek County. All right, drayage barns refer to the barns that kept horses. Here's a great example that you can go visit anytime. It's at the cantonment over near Fort Reno, or El Reno. And this is the historical site. So this was a government mule barn, believe it or not. Mules used for freighting, who knows what else, moving things around the military base. This one is way down in Choctaw County, and it is a drayage barn. It was actually a mule barn, not a saddle horse barn. Is now, though, a mule barn that was used by Dirks Timber Company, and that was the predecessor to Weyerhaeuser down in the southeastern part of the state, the big timber and paper pulp company. This was, of course, in the logging industry, you got to have plenty of horsepower or mule power. This one is associated with the oil industry, and this is the Woolco drayage barn, and it was located on Highway 11 in Osage County at the crossroads named for the Wolverine Oil Company, Woolco. This barn was raised just a few months after I recorded it way back in 2013, so it is not there anymore, and it's a real shame because it was really kind of a neat historical site. Here's a photo of the oil field crews they used the horses in this barn to move timbers for oil derricks, the old wooden oil derricks, also for moving heavy oil field equipment through Osage County, which is no easy task because there weren't a lot of roads in Osage County, and it's up and down. So moving them miles across country, dragging stuff. So you might be able to look and match the rocks up in these two photos, one from 2013 and one from probably about 1923 or 33. Midwest feeder barns. This is just an expose of some really big barns. The so-called Midwest feeder barn is a term that the barn aficionados use, and it is a term that refers to the practice of feeding beef cattle corn. And this arose in the Ohio Valley way back in the early 1800s. It became established in the Corn Belt of Illinois, Iowa, Indiana, and the Corn Belt feeding system is still around today, but it's just geographically changed a bit. The folks who settled north, central, and northwest Oklahoma brought with them an idea of a barn, and that was the Midwest feeder barn. My ancestors came to Payne County in 1889 and 1892 from Indiana. Strangely, they came from the same state. Many of the people who settled this part of northwestern, the Republican part, the historically Republican part of Oklahoma, early Republican part of Oklahoma, came from those Midwestern states, and they realized that a barn to them was the Midwest feeder barn. Now, it was never really used for the same purpose. Like I said, in Oklahoma, the beef cattle industry doesn't utilize barns the way they did up in the northern states. So up in Nebraska and the Dakotas, you might see something like it, or Iowa, they would have used these in the old days, but they were used for general farming. So these were places where farmers kept their horse teams. It's where they stored hay up in the hay mow in the loft, and stored grain as well as tack all the things that they needed on the farm. Later on, most of the openings for the barn weren't large enough to store the larger equipment like tractors. So they became obsolete. Once farms mechanized in the middle part of the 20th century after World War II, barns were essentially obsolete except for maybe storing hay bales, and those barns later became obsolete in the 80s when hay bales went from being square bales to 1-ton rolled bales, and there you have a nice silo beside it. So I'm going to run through some of these giant barns. Most of these are located not too far away from Stillwater, between Stillwater and Ponca City and Enid. All the ones that I've picked here, and we have hundreds more to look at. The biggest barns in the state, by the way, are in an area from Blackwell up to about Pond Creek around Medford, that area. So these are the biggest ones in the state. Granaries. A granary is a place where you store grain, and this is something you find in the wheat belt. I'm going to try to speed up a little bit here. This is down in the southwest part of the state where you have lots of good sand to mix your own concrete. So we find concrete, rectangular, in this case, homemade brick, it looks like, granaries. And elsewhere in the southern part of the state and the eastern part of the state, you tend to find frame granaries where you need granaries. I've noticed that a lot of these frame granaries are really tall, kind of interesting that way. Now, the one that most impresses me because I've been trained in this field of geography is the transverse crib type granary. And the transverse crib barn is the official barn of the Upland South. It is the most ubiquitous barn in the southern states, really south of the Ohio River and all the way to Oklahoma and Texas. The most common type of barn, period. And traditionally, the transverse crib barn had 3 or 4 uses. You stored hay in the loft. You stored corn or grain in the grain bin. You may have had a stall for your workhorse or mule, and you had a storage area, a crib, where you stored tack and maybe feed grains. So anyway, the transverse crib barn was a multi-purpose barn for most of its history until it got to the high plains. And when the Upland South met the high plains, as it does in Oklahoma, farmers started using the same form. More than likely, farmers from the Upland South and the Ohio Valley built this form for one reason, and that was, well, maybe two, maybe some hay storage up high. But basically, they just created a bunch of grain bins. So the grain bins essentially, these are little transverse crib barns or transverse frame barns, to be technical about it. And all they do is store grain. This is one of my favorites from southwestern Oklahoma. That beautiful green wheat must have been in May. I was probably trying to finish up. And the outside access is there. So this is a really old one. It's over 100, probably over 120 years old. Located up in Ellis County, I believe. So, and as you get farther north and farther west, the transverse frame form begins to lose the pitch on the roof begins to flatten out. So it gets lower pitched roofs. And once you get to the high plains where wheat production was booming back in the teens and the 20s before the Dust Bowl, you have multiple sets of transverse crib granaries with completely with holes with auger holes in the roof. So you can see that auger right there. That's the corkscrew thing that moves grain up into the granary and drops it. These are very dangerous very dangerous tools. Lots of farmers lost arms in those things. So another example of a, I didn't go in this, by the way, it's posted. So this was a, just to show you how the roof line changes. Okay, horse barns, I'll cover very quickly. Horse barns, this is one that you may have seen on the K4 presentation with Gavin. This is the one just right outside of off of I-35 and Highway 51. Horse barns are always pretty because horses are just a little closer to humans than cattle. At least we kind of objectify them that way, don't we? So horse barns tend to be pretty fancy. Sometimes they even look like houses. This is one of the most interesting ones I've seen. This is in pretty much the middle of Osage County. It's far from anything, and it hadn't been used for a very long time. This one's down by Shawnee, and it's actually in Seminole County. And this was a great example of a horse barn still in use, and it's still well taken care of, and it's not going anywhere anytime soon. Stables, on the other hand, are generally found on the farm, and you don't find very many of these things. They are just, the way that you see a stable is it's usually got a shed roof on it like this, and the stalls have windows so the animals can look outside, and usually they don't have any windows on the back, so they're facing usually facing the house. Loafing sheds are very, very common. You'll see these everywhere. Sometimes they're independent of a barn like this one, or sorry, I keep doing that. Or they're attached to an existing barn. And what a loafing shed is it's usually always on the south side of the building, or it faces south. And this is for cattle, generally beef cattle, maybe horses too, to access when the weather is bad. So it's really for cold weather, and especially very cold winds and blizzards, to allow the animals to get out of the weather. It's really not so much for shade in the summertime. You see these all over the place, and in one form or another. Almost always on the south facing. If they're not south facing, they tend to be west facing, or east facing, excuse me, east. Loafing sheds. Sometimes an old barn that was probably used for dairy purposes early on gets repurposed by knocking a side out of it and making it into a loafing shed. That's one of the most common uses for dairy barns in a beef production zone. All right, milk houses are another kind of interesting thing, and I'm not sure if I can run over, but I'll try to get this in as much as I possibly can. A milk house is something that was required by the USDA after World War II. And this is a facility that allows the milk cans and the milk itself to be safe. So USDA had a lot of weird things. For example, they required barns to be painted white. Dairy barns. If you were going to have a grade A dairy, you had to paint your barn white. You also had to have a lot of concrete, and you had to have a milk house. A milk house is that facility that has running water, and it's separate from the barn. It has to be separate from the barn, because before this regulation, milking occurred in the barn, and a dairy barn is not the most sterile place in the world. This is an example of I think this is the Townley Dairy, one of the dairies in Oklahoma City area, milking the cows. Now, I find the most milk houses in the Amish country, in the Amish areas of the state. So this is an Amish barn and a milk house, another Amish barn in western Oklahoma, and a milk house. one attached to the milk house, but it's concrete. This is in the western. This is in the Panhandle. I'm not sure if you call that a regulation milk house, but we'll call it one. Sometimes it's just a wing off of a large dairy building, dairy barn like these. I like this photograph because it has a silo, it has a dairy barn, and it has with a milk house. And of course, it's not being used for dairy anymore. It's being used for Angus beef cattle. Here's some other examples. Now, milk houses are different from other. This is a really cool one. Milk houses are different from milking parlors, which I want to make a distinction of. Milking parlor is the facility where dairy cows are milked according to USDA grade A standards. And milking parlors are always built out of concrete blocks. And they are separate from the dairy barn. So this was a regulation. This was one of the things that forced a lot of small scale dairy farmers out of business, having to build these separate masonry facilities for actually milking the cows. It could be hosed down and washed, and it was always painted, almost always painted white. You can see traces of white paint on some of these. These have been abandoned forever. Smaller scale dairies replaced by the mega dairies like, well, I won't name them. But you see, this is essentially this would milk probably 10 cows at a time. The cows, of course, line up to be milked. They can't wait. And once they get in, they back themselves into the stanchion and milking proceeds. Okay, that's a nice one. I'm moving on to Quonset huts. And Quonset huts aren't really specific uses, but they're kind of neat. You find them all over the place. There are sort of the original unique Quonset huts like these. This is a wooden one. And then you have the sort of later, what we might call aftermarket barn style Quonset hut barns. These sometimes come in kits like this one. And they're pretty common. Now, silos, I wanted to mention something about silos. We don't have time to really get into this, but the term silo comes from the Greek siros, and that translates to a pit for storing grain. And a silo is what we think of as a silo. There are actually three types of silos. There's the trench or below ground silo that you see here. It's basically just something you dig out a trench and fill it up with chopped up, in this case, Kaffir corn or some kind of sorghum, green sorghum. And you cover it up, you pack it down and you cover it up, and basically creates a fermented high protein feed for cattle, mostly during the wintertime. And so there are different ways of making silage. The other type, that we're most familiar with, is the tower silo. And here's a tower silo being filled with chopped corn. And you can see that they have a steam tractor here with that's operating with a big long conveyor belt, turning a chopper and taking that chopped silage and getting it up the silo through an auger here that's mounted on the bottom. Again, dangerous work. And what the silo is always attached to the barn, and we're talking a dairy barn always. So this is the winter feed that you would feed the cattle inside the cows inside the barn. Highly nutritious and stinky. It's basically kimchi for cattle. But kimchi is good for you. And it's also, okay, so you see some dairy farms here. And but anymore, you might see the blue glass Harvestor systems, the A.O. Smith Harvestor trademark silos. These generally replace the concrete sort of unit block. These kind of fit together like building blocks. They're just pre-poured chunks of concrete that lock together. I'll show you an example of what they look like up close. My favorite ones are these. These are made out of a glazed tile. So this is, architectural stuff, but the glazed tile are pretty rare. You don't find these very often. And you do find the use of what we call terracotta load-bearing structural blocks or tile, and that's the stuff that is sort of what you'll find on the inside. This is a great example of one where somebody's gotten those interior blocks that they put in commercial buildings and pasted them together to make a silo. Same barn. This is in Guthrie. And here's a close-up of what those concrete silos look like. So the concrete silos were built in the teens and the 20s generally, before they preceded the harvestors, which came out, I think, in the 60s maybe. But they just fit together, and then you put these steel bands around them. Here's another one out, and this is in Woodward. And my very favorite up in Grant County. This is a silo that you can see there that this is like an antique, unchanged pretty much. Really neat little hand-built silo. Another one from up in Big Cabin up in northeast Oklahoma. This is a really tall one. This is the Keeney Dairy Barn. And a few others. This is like northeast Oklahoma. But silos are there, and this is actually down in Oklahoma City. Let's see. It may not be there because it was in Moore. I think it may have gotten leveled by a tornado. And those block tiles don't always fit there. I'll have to tell you about that. You can ask me about this later. There's a cow in that thing. Smokehouses, I'll finish up with, I guess, this. Smokehouses are another part of the agricultural landscape of the subsistence farm. And you find these mostly in southeast Oklahoma. There are a few in northeast Oklahoma, but I found most of these in southeast Oklahoma. These are little short buildings, look like little log houses or cabins. They are, of course, used for curing pork, basically curing pork, salting it, maybe smoking it. It's not necessarily only smoking. And they have a cantilevered roof on them. You notice that cantilever, the overhang, and that's either traditional or actually used as a on the ridge line. You would hang a hog carcass after doing a hog killing to dress out the hog before you put him up in salt. All right, thank you so much, and thanks for your patience. And I'm sorry we had a little mess up with the software this time. We'll try to be sure not to do that. So I hope you have questions.
Well, I don't see any questions this evening, but I do recommend that if anybody has any questions after the fact, feel free to either contact myself or Dr. Bays, and we'll make sure that he gets those answered for you. So we thank all of you for attending the 5th Shut the Door Barns in Oklahoma presentation. And we hope
Anybody has a question about that cow?
Oh, you want to find out about the cow? Okay,
I'll tell you about it, since everybody's probably long gone anyway. I just ran across this. It's bizarre. The Daily Oklahoman reported in 1961 that Grady the cow, who had fallen into this silo in 1949, had finally passed away. This cow, I have no idea other than that, apparently fell into a silo, like jumped into a silo. I don't know how that happens. Fell down in there, and the farmer continued to feed her, and maybe it was a he, I don't know. I guess it was a cow, it was a she. But fed her and watered her, and she lived for, well, I guess 12 more years. kind of an awful distance.
That's pretty amazing.
Yeah, that's the Daily Oklahoman reporting. Don't quote me on it. All right. Well, thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you, Brad, and for anyone who wants to attend the 6th and final presentation.